It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the busy streets of Ridgeville. 16-year-old Jasmine Daniels walked out of the corner store, holding a bottle of water and a pack of gum she had just bought. She had her headphones in, her favorite playlist keeping her company as she texted her best friend about their plans for the weekend. Jasmine was your typical teenager, smart, bubbly, and full of life. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer someday, inspired by her father, Captain Daniel Johnson, a respected police officer in their city. The streets were alive with activity. Cars honked as people bustled about, running errands and chatting with their neighbors. Jasmine loved her neighborhood despite its flaws. She felt safe there, surrounded by familiar faces and the comforting rhythm of everyday life. But that afternoon, something didn't feel quite right. Jasmine noticed a police car parked across the street. It wasn't unusual to see patrol cars around, but this one seemed different. The officer inside, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, appeared to be watching her. She brushed off the unease, telling herself she was imagining things. After all, her dad had always taught her to be respectful and cooperative with police officers. "They're there to help us," he would say. As Jasmine turned the corner toward home, she heard the sound of tires rolling behind her. She glanced back and saw the patrol car moving slowly. Her heartbeat quickened, but she reminded herself there was no reason to worry. She hadn't done anything wrong. "Excuse me, miss," a deep voice called out. Jasmine stopped and turned around, her pulse racing. The officer, whose name tag read Matthews, stepped out of the car. He was tall, with a crisp uniform and a pair of dark sunglasses that hid his eyes. He didn't smile. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Matthews said, his tone firm. "Sure," Jasmine replied, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Is something wrong, officer?" Matthews crossed his arms. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Do you mind showing me what's in your bag?" Jasmine hesitated. Her dad had told her she had the right to ask questions, but she didn't want to seem uncooperative. She handed over her small backpack, which only contained her wallet, a notebook, and the items she had just bought from the store. "Here you go," she said, forcing a polite smile. "I just came from the store." Matthews rummaged through the bag, taking his time. Jasmine shifted nervously, glancing at the few passers-by who quickly looked away. She felt exposed, as if everyone around her had suddenly disappeared, leaving her alone under the officer's scrutiny. Finally, Matthews handed the bag back to her. "You can go," he said curtly, his tone dismissive. Relief washed over Jasmine, but it was mixed with confusion and unease. She felt like she had done something wrong, even though she hadn't. As she walked away, Matthews stood there watching her, his presence heavy and unsettling. By the time Jasmine got home, her mother, Angela, noticed something was off immediately. Jasmine's usual cheerful demeanor was replaced with silence and a distant look in her eyes. "Jasmine, are you okay?" Angela asked gently. Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine," she said softly. But deep down, she knew she wasn't. This was only the beginning of a day that would change everything. Jasmine couldn't shake off the strange feeling from her encounter with Officer Matthews. Her mom's concerned look stayed in her mind, but she wasn't ready to talk about what had happened. Instead, she went to her room, closed the door, and tried to distract herself by listening to music. But no matter how loud the music played, her thoughts kept going back to that uncomfortable moment on the street. The next day, Jasmine decided to visit her friend Tanya, hoping a friendly chat would make her feel better. Tanya lived just a few blocks away, so Jasmine put on her sneakers and headed out, feeling a little lighter as the fresh air hit her face. But as she walked down the street, the same patrol car appeared again, slowly rolling toward her. Her heart sank. It was Officer Matthews. Not again, Jasmine thought, trying to stay calm. She looked straight ahead and kept walking, pretending not to notice him. Maybe he would just pass by. "Hey, you, stop right there," Matthews called out, his voice loud and commanding. Jasmine froze. She turned around, trying to mask her fear with a polite smile. "Yes, officer." Matthews stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt and walking toward her. "I need to ask you some questions," he said, his tone firm, but with a hint of something Jasmine couldn't quite place. "About what?" she asked carefully. "There's been some trouble around here lately," Matthews said vaguely. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Jasmine's mind raced. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She had never even gotten detention at school, let alone been involved in anything criminal. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, trying to stay calm. Matthews smirked slightly. "Why don't you let me do my job and stop asking questions?" Jasmine nodded reluctantly. "Okay, what do you need from me?" "I'm going to need to check your bag again," he said. Jasmine hesitated, remembering how uncomfortable she had felt the day before, but she didn't want to argue. Slowly, she handed over her bag, which only had her phone, a notebook, and some snacks. As Matthews rifled through her belongings, Jasmine felt the same unsettling feeling she had the day before. His hands lingered a little too long, and his demeanor felt invasive rather than professional. She wanted to say something, to ask him to stop, but fear held her back. Finally, he handed the bag back to her. "You can go," he said casually, as if nothing had happened. Jasmine wanted to scream. She wanted to ask why he was targeting her, why he treated her like this when she had done nothing wrong. But instead she mumbled, "Thank you," and walked away, her heart pounding. As soon as she got to Tanya's house, she burst into tears. Tanya was shocked. "What happened, Jasmine? Are you okay?" Jasmine told her everything, her voice trembling with anger and frustration. "I don't understand why he keeps bothering me," she said. "I didn't do anything." Tanya hugged her tightly. "This isn't right, Jasmine. You need to tell someone." But who could Jasmine tell? She felt helpless, scared, and small. Little did she know, the person who could make things right was just a phone call away. That evening, Jasmine sat in her room, her thoughts spinning. Tanya's words kept echoing in her mind. "You need to tell someone." She knew her parents would be upset if they found out, but she also knew they would want to protect her. After a long moment of hesitation, she made up her mind. Jasmine walked into the living room, where her mother, Angela, was folding laundry. "Mom, can I talk to you about something?" she asked quietly. Angela looked up, sensing the seriousness in her daughter's tone. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind?" Jasmine hesitated, her hands nervously twisting together. Then the words spilled out in a rush as she told her mom everything. How Officer Matthews had stopped her twice, searched her bag, and made her feel small and powerless. By the time she finished, her voice was shaking, and tears were streaming down her face. Angela's face grew tight with concern and anger. "He did what?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. She hugged Jasmine tightly. "You should have told me this the first time it happened." "I didn't know what to do," Jasmine admitted. "I didn't want to make things worse." Angela pulled back and looked into Jasmine's eyes. "You did nothing wrong, Jasmine. That officer had no right to treat you like that." Angela immediately called her husband, Captain Daniel Johnson, who was still at work at the police precinct. As soon as he picked up the phone, she explained everything. "What?" Daniel's voice boomed through the phone. He stopped her twice. "What's his name?" "Matthews," Angela said. She said his name tag said Matthews. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. "I'll handle this. Tell Jasmine not to worry." About an hour later, Daniel walked through the front door, still in his uniform. His usual calm, commanding presence was overshadowed by the storm brewing in his eyes. He sat down with Jasmine and Angela at the kitchen table, listening carefully as Jasmine repeated her story. "Jasmine," he said softly when she finished, "I'm so sorry you had to go through this. That's not how police officers are supposed to act. He was wrong, completely wrong, and I'm going to make sure he's held accountable." Jasmine nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "I just don't want him to hurt anyone else," she said. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He won't. I promise you." The next morning, Daniel arrived at the precinct early. He requested Matthew's file and began digging into his record. What he found made his blood boil. Matthews had several complaints filed against him for inappropriate behavior during stops, but none of them had resulted in any real consequences. It was a pattern, a dangerous one. Daniel decided it was time to confront Matthews directly. He called him into his office. When Matthews walked in, he looked confident, even smug, not realizing who Jasmine's father was. "You wanted to see me, Captain," Matthews said casually. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Yes, I do. Let's talk about what you've been doing on patrol." For the first time, Matthews's smug expression faltered. He had no idea the storm he was about to face. Captain Daniel Johnson sat behind his desk, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at Officer Matthews. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Matthews shifted uncomfortably under Daniel's piercing gaze, unsure of what was coming but sensing it wasn't good. "Do you know why I called you in here?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but firm. "No, sir," Matthews replied, trying to sound confident. "I assume it's about routine matters." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Routine matters? No, Matthews. It's about you stopping my daughter, Jasmine, twice this week and searching her without cause." Matthews froze, his face paling. "Your daughter?" he repeated, the confidence draining from his voice. "Yes, my daughter," Daniel said sharply, his tone cutting through the room like a knife. "And don't play dumb. You know exactly who I'm talking about." Matthews opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel held up a hand to silence him. "I've reviewed your record, Matthews. It's not the first time you've been accused of misconduct. But let me make one thing clear. This time, you picked the wrong person." "Captain, I was just doing my job," Matthews said quickly, trying to regain his composure. "I thought she fit the description of someone suspicious in the area." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Really? A 16-year-old girl walking home with a backpack? That's suspicious to you? Or is it that she's a young black girl who happened to cross your path?" "Sir," Matthews began, but Daniel cut him off again. "Save it," Daniel snapped. "Your so-called routine checks weren't about doing your job. They were about intimidation. You made my daughter feel scared and powerless, and that's unacceptable. You didn't just cross a line, you shattered it." Matthews sat in silence, his smug demeanor completely gone. The weight of Daniel's words hung heavily in the air. "This is what's going to happen," Daniel continued, his voice firm. "I've already reported your actions to Internal Affairs. They'll be conducting a full investigation into your behavior, not just with Jasmine but with every complaint on your record. And let me warn you, if I find any evidence that you've abused your authority again, I will personally see to it that you're held accountable." "Captain, Matthews tried again, but his words faltered. He could see that there was no use arguing. Daniel wasn't just any officer. He was a man of integrity, someone who wouldn't let injustice slide, not even within his own department. "You're dismissed," Daniel said, his tone final. "But don't think for a second that this is over." Matthews stood up, his face a mixture of anger and fear. He left the office without another word, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Alone in the room, Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. He knew this was only the beginning. Taking on someone like Matthews wouldn't be easy, but for Jasmine, and for every person who had ever been mistreated, Daniel was ready for the fight ahead. At home that evening, Daniel sat with Jasmine and Angela, reassuring them that justice would be served. Jasmine felt a little stronger knowing her father believed in her and was taking action. But deep down, Daniel knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. This battle was far from over, and he was prepared for whatever came next. The next few days were filled with tension. Daniel knew that confronting Officer Matthews was just the first step. The real challenge was what came next, making sure Matthews faced the consequences for his actions and ensuring that Jasmine, and others like her, would never have to experience this kind of treatment again. Internal Affairs had launched an investigation into Matthews' behavior. Daniel was careful not to speak too much about the situation around the precinct, knowing that officers often kept a close eye on each other. But he didn't need to say much. His reputation as a dedicated, no-nonsense leader in the department already spoke for itself. Back at home, Jasmine still struggled to find peace. Even though her dad was taking charge of the situation, she couldn't shake the fear that Matthews would somehow retaliate. The days after the confrontation felt long and heavy, each one bringing more questions than answers. One evening, Jasmine sat with her mother on the porch, the cool evening air helping to ease the tension in her shoulders. Angela had noticed the worry lines on Jasmine's face growing deeper, and she knew that her daughter was holding a lot inside. "Jasmine, how are you feeling?" Angela asked gently, sitting beside her. Jasmine sighed, staring out at the quiet street. "I don't know. I know Dad is doing everything he can. But what if nothing changes? What if he's not punished?" Angela gave her a soft smile, trying to reassure her. "Your father is a man of his word, Jasmine. He won't stop until justice is done. But remember, you don't have to carry this weight alone. We're all in this together." Jasmine nodded slowly, taking comfort in her mother's words. The feeling of not being alone, of knowing that her family was standing beside her, gave her a strength she hadn't realized she had. The next day, Daniel called a meeting with Internal Affairs to discuss the progress of the investigation. He knew that the road to justice would be long, and he wasn't naive enough to think that Matthew's punishment would come easily. But Daniel was determined to see it through. He couldn't stand the thought of his daughter, anyone, being treated like she had been. Meanwhile, news of Jasmine's situation started to spread through the community. People began to talk, and more stories came to light about Matthew's past actions. Some were quiet whispers, while others were more vocal, but the pattern was clear. Matthews had crossed a line too many times. His behavior was part of a larger problem that couldn't be ignored any longer. Jasmine's classmates, some of whom had witnessed the incident, began to speak out as well. They wanted to show their support, rallying behind her to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. Soon, local activists joined in, organizing peaceful protests and petition drives, calling for accountability in the police force. Jasmine had become a symbol for change, and even though it frightened her at first, she began to feel empowered by the support around her. Despite all of this, she couldn't help but wonder, what if it wasn't enough? What if Matthew's connections within the department protected him from the consequences he deserved? But Jasmine refused to give up. She knew that what her father was doing, what the community was doing, was bigger than just one officer. This was about standing up for what was right, about ensuring that the system was held accountable for its actions. As Daniel continued to push for justice, Jasmine found herself slowly gaining confidence. Every step taken was a step closer to the truth being revealed. She just had to hold on a little longer. As the investigation into Officer Matthews continued, tensions began to rise. News of the situation spread beyond the community, and soon, the entire city was talking about it. Some people supported Jasmine, her family, and the call for accountability. Others, however, were not so quick to agree. The backlash was strong, and it came from unexpected places. Within the police department, there were whispers. Some officers expressed their support for Matthews, citing his years of service and his reputation as a good cop. They argued that the accusations against him were exaggerated, and that Jasmine's father, Captain Daniel Johnson, was only pushing the case because of his position. There were even rumors that some officers were trying to downplay the situation, hoping it would all blow over quickly. Daniel wasn't surprised by the resistance. He had known that standing up for what was right, especially when it involved one of his own, would come with a cost. But he was prepared, his resolve to bring justice to his daughter, and to anyone else Matthews had wronged, was stronger than ever. At home, Jasmine could feel the tension mounting. Her father came home late almost every night, deep in conversation with his colleagues and investigators. Angela tried to keep things as normal as possible, but the stress was hard to ignore. Jasmine was also facing pressure from her friends at school. While many of them supported her, some didn't know what to believe. A few students began making hurtful comments, questioning whether her father was simply using his power to settle a personal score. Others were more cautious, unsure of where they stood in the middle of the growing controversy. One afternoon, after a particularly tense day at school, Jasmine came home feeling exhausted. She dropped her backpack onto the floor and collapsed onto the couch, feeling like the world was closing in on her. "Jasmine, are you okay?" Angela asked, noticing her daughter's weary expression. Jasmine looked up, her eyes tired. "I don't know, Mom. It feels like everyone's against us. Even some of the teachers don't know what to think." Angela sat down next to her. "Sweetheart, when you stand up for what's right, there are always people who won't understand. It's hard, but you're doing the right thing. You're showing others that it's okay to speak out when something is wrong." Jasmine nodded slowly, but the weight of the situation still felt heavy. She didn't want to be the center of attention anymore. She just wanted everything to go back to normal. Later that evening, Daniel returned home and could see the exhaustion in his daughter's eyes. He sat down next to her and gave her a reassuring smile. "How are you holding up?" "I'm trying, Dad," Jasmine said quietly. "But it's hard. People are starting to say things. I feel like I'm being blamed for all of this." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Jasmine, this isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. What you're doing is brave. You're helping to make sure something like this doesn't happen to anyone else, and that's something to be proud of." "I don't know if I can keep going," Jasmine admitted, her voice breaking. "You don't have to do it alone," Daniel said gently. "We're all in this together. And no matter what happens, I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." Jasmine looked up at her father, finding comfort in his words. She wasn't sure how much longer the road ahead would be, but with her family by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. Despite the backlash, Jasmine found new strength. She realized that standing up for what was right was never easy, but it was always worth it. And slowly, she began to see that the fight wasn't just about one officer. It was about changing the system, making it better for everyone. As the investigation into Officer Matthews' actions continued, the pressure began to mount. It wasn't just Jasmine's community that was watching. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a resolution. Would Matthews face consequences for his behavior, or would his position in the police force shield him from the truth? The calls for justice grew louder. Activists organized peaceful marches, and local leaders spoke out, demanding accountability. Even some officers in the precinct, who had once been quiet about Matthews' behavior, began to open up. Slowly, the truth about Matthews' history of misconduct came to light. Jasmine's courage in speaking out had sparked something bigger than just a single incident. It was a movement for change. But not everyone in the department was happy about the attention. Some officers, loyal to Matthews, attempted to defend him, claiming that the accusations were overblown. They tried to argue that Matthews had been a dedicated officer for years, that one mistake shouldn't ruin his career. But those voices were growing quieter as more evidence came forward, and public opinion began to shift. Daniel, who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, knew the fight was far from over. He had always believed in doing what was right, but now the situation felt more personal. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter. He was fighting to protect every person who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. One afternoon, while Daniel was at the precinct meeting with Internal Affairs, Jasmine sat at home with her mom, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The constant news stories, the protests, and the questions from her friends. It all felt like too much sometimes. But as she thought about the reason she had spoken up, she knew she couldn't back down now. "I'm proud of you," Angela said, sitting beside her. "I know this hasn't been easy, but you're showing everyone what real strength looks like." Jasmine gave a small smile. "It's just, I don't want to make things worse. What if nothing changes?" Angela gently placed her hand on Jasmine's. "Sometimes change doesn't come right away, but every step you take, every voice you raise, it matters. You've already made a difference." That evening, Daniel came home with good news. The investigation had made significant progress, and Matthews was finally facing charges for his actions. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a huge step toward accountability. "We did it," Daniel said, his voice filled with relief. "Matthews is being put on leave while the department reviews his actions. Internal Affairs will be pressing charges. It's not over yet, but it's a start." Jasmine felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had been so afraid that Matthews would get away with it, that the system would protect him just because he was an officer. But now, the truth was coming to light. Justice was being served. The following days were filled with news reports and press conferences as the story continued to unfold. The investigation showed that Matthews' behavior had crossed a line many times before, and now he would have to answer for it. For Jasmine, it was both a victory and a reminder of why it was important to stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult it seemed. Although the road ahead wasn't easy, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had spoken out for herself, but now she was speaking out for everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a future where justice and fairness were the rule, not the exception. With her family by her side, Jasmine knew they had already won the most important battle, and the journey for change was just beginning. As the investigation into Officer Matthews progressed, things began to change. The public's support for Jasmine grew stronger, but the backlash also became more intense. People in the community had taken sides. There were those who believed that Matthews should be held accountable for his actions, and then there were those who felt the accusations were exaggerated, that Jasmine's father was using his position to attack a loyal officer. Despite this division, Jasmine stayed focused. She knew that standing up for what was right was never going to be easy. Her father's courage had inspired her, but now it was her turn to stand firm. At school, the tension was palpable. Jasmine overheard classmates discussing the case in the hallways. Some supported her, telling her they admired her bravery. But there were others who questioned her actions. Some said that her dad's position in the police department was making things too complicated, that Jasmine was putting the family in a difficult situation. "Are you sure your dad should be doing this?" one of her classmates asked, his voice filled with doubt. "What if it causes problems for everyone? He's a captain. This could hurt his career." Jasmine swallowed, holding back the frustration building inside her. "My dad is doing the right thing," she replied. "He's standing up for me, for what's right. That's what matters." But even as she spoke, doubts lingered in her mind. What if the people who didn't believe her were right? What if this situation was bigger than she could handle? At home, the discussions with her family grew more serious. Daniel, who had been dealing with pressure from both his colleagues and the media, knew that the battle was far from over. Although Matthews had been placed on leave, there was still the question of whether the department would follow through with the charges. No one wanted to speak too soon, but the sense of uncertainty was hanging over everyone. One evening after dinner, Daniel sat down with Jasmine and Angela to talk about the future. "I know this has been tough on all of us," he said, his voice softer than usual. "The pressure is only going to get worse, and I need you both to know that I'm in this with you, no matter what." Jasmine nodded, but her mind was racing. She appreciated her father's support, but she also knew that their fight wasn't just against Matthews. It was against a system that had allowed things like this to happen for so long. "Dad, do you think things will really change?" Jasmine asked, her voice full of concern. "What if nothing really happens to him? What if he just goes back to his job?" Daniel gave her a serious look, his voice steady. "I won't let that happen, Jasmine. We've come too far, and we've made too much noise for them to ignore us now." Change might not come as quickly as we wanted, but it's already started. The conversations we're having, the awareness we're raising, it's all part of the process. Jasmine felt a small sense of reassurance. She wasn't alone in this, and neither was her father. Together, they were making a difference. But the path ahead was still uncertain, and they would need to stay strong. The next day, Jasmine walked to school with a newfound sense of determination. The challenges were far from over, but she knew that she couldn't back down now. Her family, her community, and even those who had questioned her were watching. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had endured. The fight for justice was bigger than any one person, and Jasmine was ready to do whatever it took to see it through to the end. Weeks went by, and the investigation into Officer Matthews continued to unfold. With every day that passed, the community's support for Jasmine and her family grew. The protests had become more organized, and the media coverage was constant. People who had once stayed silent began to speak out, sharing their own experiences and demanding change. Jasmine had never imagined that something as simple as her own story could lead to such a powerful movement. But despite all the noise around her, Jasmine felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. Every time she walked through the halls of her school, she could feel the eyes of others on her. Some were supportive, others skeptical, and a few simply avoided her, unsure of what to think. The pressure was exhausting, and there were moments when she wondered if it was all worth it. One evening, after a particularly tiring day, Jasmine sat on the porch with her mother, gazing at the sunset. The sky was a mix of oranges and pinks, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of peace. Angela sat beside her, sensing her daughter's unease. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Angela said softly. Jasmine nodded, her voice quiet. "I didn't expect it to be like this. It's hard to keep going when everything feels so out of control." Angela wrapped an arm around her daughter. "I know, sweetie, but you've already done so much. You've shown incredible strength, and you've inspired so many people. Just remember that none of this is your fault. You're not carrying this burden alone." Jasmine leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling the comfort of her embrace. "I never wanted to be the center of attention. I just wanted things to be right, for everything to go back to normal." "It will," Angela said gently. "But change takes time, and sometimes it takes something big to make people listen." The following week, Daniel came home from a meeting with the department. Matthews had been officially charged, and the investigation was moving forward. While it was still unclear what the final outcome would be, the evidence against Matthews was strong. He would have to answer for his actions, and no one was going to let him slide this time. "We're getting closer," Daniel said as he sat down with Jasmine and Angela. "I know it's been a long journey, but we're on the right path. Matthews is being held accountable, and that's what matters." Jasmine looked at her father, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Daniel smiled, his pride in his daughter evident. "You didn't need me to fight for you, Jasmine. You've been strong from the start. I'm just proud to stand with you." As the days passed, Jasmine began to feel a sense of healing. It wasn't instant, and it didn't make all the hurt go away. But she could see that things were changing. The conversations in the community, the marches, the support from her friends, they were all signs that people were waking up, that change was possible. The last few months had been the hardest of Jasmine's life, but they had also been the most empowering. She had found her voice, and in doing so, had become part of something bigger than herself. She was no longer just a victim of injustice. She was an advocate for change, a symbol of strength and resilience. Jasmine's story didn't end with Matthew's charges. It was only the beginning. As she looked ahead, she knew that there would be more challenges, but she was ready to face them. With her family by her side, and a community that had come together in support, Jasmine knew that no matter what happened, she had already won the most important victory: the courage to stand up for what was right.